Hello and welcome everyone to the last video for this class. This is a final exam overview, audio only. I do it this way so you can see the text on the screen a little bit more easily. And before we start, I just wanted to share my screen here first by showing you where to find the final exam, just like the midterm. If you click on evaluation, go to quizzes, and there it is, right there. Online final exam, modules 8 to 13, and it's been open and available for quite some time, but it is going to close on April 16th. So not this coming Sunday, but next Sunday. The structure of the test is the following. It's in 4 parts, just like the midterm was, with 10 true-false questions in the first part, worth 10. The second and fourth section have got some options. Number 2, identify and explain. There's 12 or 13 different terms, answer 5 only, and that will give you a total of 10 marks. Probably a couple of sentences is more than enough to answer each one. The third part, you have to answer all of them. Short answer questions, there's 5 of them, and they're each worth 3 marks, a total of 15. And then the last one is a longer answer or essay question, as it typically is known, but it's fairly open. Especially given what we have been talking about in the course on postmodernism. I'll tell you that much. It's a question about postmodernism, but not one that is just going to be like just freak you out. It's something that you are going to be able to use to think about, and that's kind of the way I like to set up my tests and my quizzes. Okay, so that's the structure of it. It's worth 50 marks. True, false 10. Identify and explain 10. Short answer 15, and long answer 15. So at this point now, I'd like to open this section up here and just basically go through the content of the course fairly quickly because there's a fair bit here, but I just want to kind of show the highlights. Okay, so Module 8, we talked about humor and ethics. And in this particular case, the ethics of humor, what we laugh at, how and why we laugh at things. We laugh at humorous exaggeration. You think back to Aristotle, we can bend, the rule of reality and truth just enough to make it funny, but not so much to distort it and basically frighten us. So reality is distorted to comic effect. So that is in itself okay. We expect people to do this. We don't expect the truth in humor, but some degree of truth telling. In other words, at the very least, we need to recognize what's going on, but reality can be distorted. Now, humor also has the potential to promote intellectual and moral virtues. We can talk about and laugh at things that people do that they shouldn't, or we have a long-held tendency to do things a certain way, and through humor we can identify that maybe there's a better way to go about doing X or Y. So using humor, we can promote intellectual and moral virtues. We can think outside conventional thought processes, the proverbial thinking outside the box. We can do this humorously. So to think humorously is to think critically. So in other words, to think about something in a unique perspective or from a unique perspective. And if we can do this, we end up letting go of our ego, and we end up with a kind of a less egocentric perspective. And that in itself is good for us because it gives us a degree of humility. So in terms of the ethics of humor, then we're going to slide into humor and ethnic capacities and how the ethnic identity fits into humor. And we found out in the module that humor can be a means of solidarity for people, especially in times of oppression, at times when people are facing a common enemy, for example. And certainly the oldest version of it is Jewish humor, or what's also known as coping humor. And the idea behind that is that it has a very positive effect on individuals that belong to the oppressed group as a whole, because it brings together some kind of solidarity and bonding with the group that you're in, because you face a common enemy. Now, big surprise, that works in the opposite direction. That kind of bonding and solidarity can be also divisive, because we then place ourselves over and against another part or another member of the community. So we end up with a kind of us and them mentality, which is quite important when we look at the last module in the postmodern world that we're in. So humor brings people together to face sort of a common issue, common enemy, common plight, but in so doing can also have the capacity to divide us. Chrissy Davies talks about two types of ethnic jokes: the stupid joke, or the stupid ethnic person who, no matter who they are, they can be literally any nationality, they're just not very bright. And that's really the key. So anyone who's stupid, vain, greedy, ruthless, deficient in some way, it doesn't matter where they're from. It's the stupidity that is being made fun of. The other one is the canny, right? Somebody who's shrewd, calculating, crafty. And again, it doesn't matter what nationality that person is. It's either the stupidity of that person or their shrewdness and stinginess. So a good ethnic joke, you could really replace one nationality with another. And if the joke is funny and is inclusive, it should still work, because it doesn't really matter the person that we are talking about, it's their behavior. So stupid and candy jokes are not complimentary. We can talk about how certain people, candy people, put way too much emphasis on success, financial success as well. And those folks too are kind of gentle reminders that we're hoping not to be viewed in the same way. So canny ethnic jokes also address our unease with being viewed by others in the same way. So it works quite well in that sense. Okay, we know that jokes are not the context in which we expect people to tell the truth. And in relation to what we just saw up above there, it's a context in which we know people are making fun of things, or sometimes of people. So truth claims are not expected in the world of comedy and humor. Jokes are fiction. So we need to consider racist and sexist jokes, which we will look at in more detail in the postmodernist part. To find them morally objectionable is whether or not we adopt the attitude towards the group that is being made fun of. If it fits with our personality, we almost don't even realize it's a joke. We need to rethink who we are. But if we can at least temporarily take the place of someone who is racist or sexist, we can at least understand how the joke works. But it's not an endorsement of the attitude. As soon as the joke is over, we go back to our normal ways and we say, yeah, that was not exactly funny. I was actually uncomfortable for you, in you saying this. But the joke itself is allegedly amoral. But as we will see, who says it, in what context, and for what reason really matters, right? This is in the second half of this course, something that is really worth thinking about, right? Who says what, in what context, and for what reason? Is it bringing people together? Is it dividing them? Is it heaping, this disgust on another group of people? And ultimately, is a joke even funny? Now, as you can imagine, racist jokes do perpetuate negative stereotypes. And what is a stereotype? That's some degree of truth twisted to a great degree until it becomes a kind of caricature. So we know that in humor, truth can be bent a little bit, reality can be bent a little bit. But again, we need to be very careful with stereotypes, because they too are constructed exactly the same way. And this is the part we need to remember. The more discriminated against the ethnic minority, the less comfortable we should be with making jokes at their expense. What we're seeing now in the pushback in the postmodern world is those individuals who were discriminated against are now pushing back and saying, hey, I'm not going to tolerate this anymore. This is wrong. And so this is kind of where we're at, because the jokes, if they're not questioned, manage actually to reinforce the real social structures that are unjust and discriminatory. No one's making fun of those or twisting them to the degree to which they become funny. They're discussing them as if they are real facts that are eternal and unchanging. Nothing is eternal and unchanging, least of all social structures that reinforce racism and sexism. So that's where humor can work and pointing out something that may sound or appear racist or sexist, but in fact could be doing something quite opposite. So Module 9, we moved into humor and religion, and we talked about how tragedy and comedy originally sort of worked together in the fertility festivals in ancient Greece. We knew that tragedy and comedy, and of course, within tragedy, there are not biblical, but religious and mythological elements. Both of those allowed the citizens of Athens to be given a different perspective on the world, right? And religion certainly has a unique perspective on the world, and it focuses on evil, it focuses on goodness, and it is a way in which we can look at the world, and through religion, whether we're experiencing tragedy or we're experiencing simply reading a parable, religion tries to find meaning and predictability and security in the world. That is its primary motive, right? Its goal. But humor actually goes in the opposite direction. It goes after incongruity and ambiguity and twisting the truth and reality to the point of not quite being unrecognizable, but enough that it's still funny. So the two fields, right, religion and humor, seem at first to not really have a whole lot in common. Now, as it turns out, that there is a degree of compatibility. So let's take a look at where that comes from. Now, Christianity warned against laughter, getting into the pleasures of the world. To laugh would be to invite the devil. And it took until almost the Middle Ages where the church even began to make a distinction between good and bad laughter. Good laughter would be a feeling of well-being. Bad laughter would be something like superiority theory, right? That even Plato, in trying to articulate what it was, did so, but didn't condone it. He said, no, this is wrong. So during the Middle Ages, the church begins to starting to make a distinction between good and bad laughter, and what was called a benign smile, a smile of just sort of acceptance, the way things are, smiling of some sort of pleasure of one kind or another. It was still part of a sound character and even, saintly disposition. So distinction between different types of laughter, different types of physiological responses like a smile or a laughter. All of these become part of the vocabulary that the church is using to distinguish humor from non-humor. Now, the Greek church as well also developed this notion of a holy fool, which came out of the carnival traditions, and these go back, these are ancient traditions. And the idea here is the holy fool is acting like a clown in order to shock people, right, out of their conventional ways of thinking. Think of a stand-up comedian, right, twisting the truth and reality to make us think differently and think in unique ways. The holy fool is doing the same thing. The holy fool character is trying to shock us out of the conventional, traditional ways of seeing and thinking, and allowing us to be open to the otherness, right, what lies on the other side of reality of religious experience. So the Feast of Fools and the Holy Fool are figures that come up within church tradition to at least allow for the possibility of being foolish, but in a way that is bringing people in, bringing people together, and letting them see that perhaps folly is not a bad thing if you're looking around and seeing people sort of stingy and worried about money and sort of material things. The fool would make fun of that, and in so doing, ask us to think of something more important, something almost metaphysical that, of course, we don't see, but we can at least consider in our minds. So the behavior of the fool becomes a way of undermining reason, just like humor typically does, offers a new perspective on what is apparently considered irrational in faith, right? Believing in something you can't see. But again, is that not what combines humor and religion together? Both of them dealing with things that can be completely abstract, that we aren't entertained only in our minds. Because think of truth and reality being bent just enough for humorous effect. We're not seeing the world bent out of shape, but we're imagining it. And so the holy fool is trying to do the same thing. So the fool rejects reality as we know it, rationality as we know it, and embraces what is, by comparison, the irrational world of the beyond, the metaphysical, what lays behind the world that we see. So that particular world is completely devoid of logic and reason, just like humor, right? And ultimately, through the holy fool and their behavior, we can gain access to what lies beyond that human world that we know of. Ted Cohen, both in the slides and in the book, talks about Jewish humor, particularly effective in dealing with incomprehensibility. If one can imagine the history of the Jewish population around the world for the last, well, practically 3,000 years or so, incomprehensibility is be something they would need to deal with. The world is bizarre, illogical, incomprehensible, irrational, and the way in which you can deal with this is hopefully through laughter and acknowledging the ambiguity of the human condition as we know it. And also, too, with a stand-up comedian and with humor, there is no sort of absolute authoritarian perspective. It's always sort of a squabbling back and forth, different people viewing things differently through their lens of humor. And this is something that is really sort of a strong component in Jewish faith, and not a big surprise, it spills over into Jewish humor. So incomprehensibility, dealing with the bizarre, the illogical, the irrational, is part of the faith, but also part of the humor that is generated from that faith. We talk about Buddhists as well, and just like Christianity, Buddhists discouraged laughter, and it was an offense for monks to laugh in public. But instead, ultimately, what was happening was the goal of Buddhism to search for a release from pain and sorrow and sometimes the nihilistic nothingness of the world. In order to rise above it, one could take a humorous approach to viewing the world. And basically, don't sweat the small stuff. And that's Buddhist thinking. Don't sweat the small stuff. So Hinduism, Buddhism share certain pro-comic features. They believe in reincarnation, which allows the soul to come back again and again. When we think about how comedians can sort of riff on an idea over and over again, reinvent it, reincarnate, a particular position, that's where that comes from. There is a degree of enlightenment in both, because if we listen to a good comedian that is intelligent, we step away, we come away enlightened, even just a little bit, rethinking some things. There is a degree of emotional detachment from all the things, the messiness of life, right? The emotional detachment, so that we can then focus on the things that really matter. A degree of mental flexibility, the ability to think of the natural and the supernatural, the physical, the metaphysical, the this world and the beyond world. That's the kind of mental flexibility that religion, Hinduism, and Buddhism for sure has, but also humor can allow us to do. And also to freeing ourselves from the ego, right? Freeing ourselves from our self-centeredness, our privileged position. And if we can do it through humor, it's a humbling experience, but also something that is also indicative of religion. Okay, so now we are about to start the first of a four-parter on humor and postmodernism. So I don't know if any of you knew what postmodernism was before we started the course. I will try to be as brief as I can here. Postmodernism is the world that we are in presently. No one knows how long it's going to last, and not until we move into something else we'll be able to look back and go, well, postmodernism evolved into this. The modern period is pretty well over, and depending on where you look, it started essentially in the early 1800s, and postmodernism more or less starts after the Second World War. So let's say in the second half of the 20th century. But it is characterized by a whole range of different things, right? The attitude of postmodernism is one of playfulness, self-consciousness, self-referencing, irony, reluctant to take anything, including itself, seriously. Everything's relative, right? Everything is up for grabs. Everything's there to be reinvented. There's a mistrust of certainty, final answers, authority figures as well. And because of that, we don't have a kind of a central tenet. We don't have a central position with postmodernism. It's kind of all over the place. And because of that, that causes an awful lot of grief to certain people. Some people like authority. Some people like, consistency. And postmodernism plays with that and just literally throws it out the window. So what's called the postmodern condition can be any number of things. Baudrillard, for example, thinks of this image-dominated world that subverts our interaction with reality. The fact that we look at the world and say, or a person, oh, she's pretty as a picture. Like, what does that even mean? Pretty as a picture. Like, what's wrong with the way that person looks, right? Regardless of a picture. So whether or not we like it, we are literally drowning in images to the point where it's distorting our sense of reality. Jean-François Lyotard talks about the skepticism we have towards meta-narratives. And these days, meta-narratives are being presented by authority figures that somehow, they can make something great again, that they are the ones that are going to lead us out of the wilderness of craziness. Just follow them, and they might break the law periodically, but it's all for your own good. Well, Lyotard says no. Be very skeptical of people that profess meta narratives, because the world now is so complex that no one single person can have the ultimate meaning or authority that it can assign to it. Umberto Eco talks about a kind of cultural and entertainment exhaustion, this idea that there's nothing new anymore to say, and all we're doing now is just kind of combining things together. And to a certain degree, it is correct, because we just seem to, when you think of all the reboots, right? This show is going to be rebooted. That movie is going to be rebooted. They're doing a remake of this. That's what Eco is saying. We're running out of ideas. Now we can, make them more ironic, more absurd. We can revisit them and say, well, we're now in 2023. What are we going to do? But the fact that we're revisiting these things, it's because we haven't come up with something utterly unique. Now, the jury's out on this. I think there may be new stories to tell. We just have to listen more carefully. Lance Olson, in trying to define the postmodern, talks about the fact that it subverts all centers of authority, very much like Lyotard's skepticism towards meta-narratives, same sort of idea. And if that is the case, anybody that is professing to be an authority of anything is going to be, up for laughs, is going to be up for grabs to be made fun of, because it's not something we are mentally willing to entertain, because we know that, yes, the world is not absolutely solid. It is complex, but the degree to which people come at us, with these authoritative narratives, yes, we should be skeptical. And yes, life is fragmented and it is sometimes incoherent. But even if that is the case, one of the ways in which we can deal with it is to laugh at it, right? And especially laugh at those individuals who are professing to be authority figures. So Olson says that both the postmodern period and the postmodern condition and humor are, yes, destructive, subversive, and negative. They embrace plurality, they embrace language games and play and inclusivity. And that is not a bad thing, because compared to that would be authoritarianism, and that, politically speaking, is pretty damn dangerous. So why not embrace plurality and play and inclusivity? Is that not more optimistic? So play, in this case, creative thinking outside the box, whatever it may be, new ways of thinking, seeing, processing, that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing people rethink the world, and at the same time, keeping those authority figures, the oppressive ones, at bay, keeping them in check, making fun of them. And if we can undermine their authority in terms of the statements that they make, then we're all going to be better off. So we need to admit that thinking is not always in a straight line. It could be contradictory. It could move in very, very different ways. And sometimes the result might be somewhat humorous. That's okay. We just keep rethinking, right, till we finally get it right. So if we can embrace play, we can embrace that as being part of this sort of overall comic amusement. Now, having said all of this, not everybody is a huge fan of the postmodern condition or the way in which humor works in with it. One of those individuals is Terry Eagleton, who otherwise is a wonderful thinker, literary theory, book that he wrote back in the 1980s. Excellent primer on lit crit. But the postmodern world is something that he is not a big fan of, because he says, look, that subversive impulse, against authority figures, the meta narratives, is not constructive. It doesn't create things. It simply is busy destroying, right? It's destructive. And he says, okay, if we keep resisting master narratives, how do we measure progress? If we are moving in fits and starts and going sideways and backwards and forwards, how do we measure progress? So the master narrative is a description, a historical description of us starting at one point and ending at another. So if we are skeptical of these kinds of master narratives, we're going to have a really tough time knowing whether we are advancing forward in any significant way or standing still. So not only the master narrative should be at least rethought, but the notion of relativism, right? That anything goes. If that is the case, we need to be really, thoughtful of the context and the perspective in which we consider things as related to one another. Sometimes it'll happen where things are just blatantly wrong. It isn't more or less wrong. They're either immoral, illegal, unethical, and there's no really discussing it. It just is what it is. So we do need to be mindful of that. Okay, in the second part of human postmodernism, we were talking about comic fictions as they tie to religious themes, which is something we had looked at a few weeks prior to that. And into the postmodern world of inclusivity and complexity, we can actually reinsert religious thought. But we don't do it in a way that is sort of, this is a religious parable and nothing else. We can actually weave it into the fabric of the story and weave it into the fabric of our daily lives. And this is what modern American authors like Thomas Pynchon have done. They can talk about religious ideas, but not in a traditional religious setting. They just seem to just occur. For example, including the supernatural world into the natural world, or the metaphysical world into the physical. It's called magic realism. If you're looking for it in South and Central America, has been around since about the 1980s. Magic realism is a way of viewing the world and really being aware of that other dimension. So in the postmodern world, we have the opportunity to discuss a much wider, we have a wider choice of things we can discuss, both in a humorous way or in a serious way, because we can weave together these tales that allow us to really deal with different realms of reality. And humor certainly will do that. Moriel, in the same module, talks about the parallels between stand-up comedians and philosophers. Many of you wrote on this, so I'll be very brief. They create imaginary characters, they question everyday experience, detachment and impartial reflection, shifts in perspective, the familiar what if, and of course, critically challenged authority. All those are the distinguishing features of both stand-up comedians and philosophy itself. Now, certain comedians in particular have been almost philosophical in the view of society, politics, law, religion. Lenny Bruce, who was working in the 50s and very early 60s, Bill Hicks in the 1980s, Russell Brand up until recently in the early 2000s. Each of them really are concerned with destroying hypocrisy, right? The authority of the authoritarian figures that tell us, do as I say, not as I do, that's hypocritical, to say the least. So all of those comedians were able to identify that hypocritical moment in a person's behavior and undermine it, like make us laugh at it by identifying it. So each of them also, to at one point or another, talked about religious issues as well, spiritual ideas that have been stripped away from the kind of dogma, in other words, authoritarian positions, right? To talk about religion, as a kind of a flexible, nuanced thing rather than the 10 Commandments. And that can be done within a comedic setting without undermining religious thought. It is just simply part of the fabric. Okay, and then finally in this module, we talked about some of the more subversive aspects of humor, and especially post-modern feminist stand-up comedians or just female comedians. Now, here we were talking about Hélène Cixous, who is a post-structuralist feminist critic, still alive and working in France. Her work, and of course the work of comedians, is to destabilize, right, that the ultimate meta-narrative, which is patriarchal thinking. So patriarchal language systems, all those components that are fundamental to our society and our cultural identity. As a meta-narrative, patriarchy needs to be undermined, absolutely. And so the work of a lot of female comedians and also post-structuralist and postmodern feminists is the same thing. They too embrace the language of humor and play. They embrace language, and in particular laughter, as a kind of defiance, sort of laughing in the face of authority figures, laughing at patriarchy, which is, again, really the glue that has held societies together for thousands of years. They're stepping up and defying it. And then finally, that kind of thinking lays at the heart, right, of the female narratives of resistance. And there, and in other marginalized groups and groups up until recently silenced, I think new stories are going to be coming out of there. I think Echo ultimately is going to lose. He might have won the battle, but I think he's going to lose the war with postmodernism. There are many other places where stories can be told. So we just need to be mindful and to listen. All right, so the last two modules, 12 and 13, humor at the limits of meaning. And here we start thinking about this serious stuff. When laughter is sort of hits its own limits, the limits of meaning, of the absence of meaning is the absence of reality. And so if that is the case, how do we define something as being funny? If it's trying to make fun of something that is ephemeral, that is lacking something, ultimately, what are we doing? Are we just simply laughing at the situation because it is absurd? And if we are trying to define what, in quotations, the word truth really means, we realize that truth is very subjective, right? Each person has their own unique perspective. And when we talk about laughter in the postmodern world, we have to agree to this, right? We have to at least engage with the notion of truth is largely absent. And truth is usually conditional upon reason and rationality and logic. Well, those have been attacked, right? Those have been undermined. So truth is a subjective, conditional thing. And if it is ephemeral, we have to ultimately just laugh at it, laugh at our inability to grasp truth. Because if we use language to define truth, and language eludes us in its final meaning, because, for example, we use words to describe other words, we're caught in a kind of, echo chamber, in a loop, and we end up in a kind of prison house. So Jean-Luc Nancy, for example, his idea of laughter is laughing at our inability to grasp the ultimate truth, because we need language to discuss language. So we can never step outside of it. And what do? Do we freak out and have a breakdown? Or do we just laugh and go, well, okay. And the well, okay is Nancy's position. We have others too, that in his case, he talks about a transcendental laughter, right? That we step outside of ourselves and that alleged comfort we have with the world and say, nope, it's all man-made, right? It's humanly created. The world is filled with indeterminacy, and we really don't have the ways in which to pin down determinacy, because we use language that is elusive and it's slippery and it gets out of our grasp. Now, there's nothing funny about that, but what we can do is, through postmodern humor, at least reflect on the fact that at the core of all these things that we think about is a kind of emptiness, right? We all agree that something will mean something at a certain point in time, and maybe it'll mean something else later on. Again, do we buckle under the anxiety, or do we just laugh at it and say, yep, okay, it's the best we can do? So there is a kind of tragedy at the core of trying to use reason and rationality and logic. And that is that, the way in which we try to do it is through a vehicle that it itself, language, that it itself is already slippery and elusive. Baudelaire, in order to add to Plato's superiority theory, talks about inferiority theory, and he talks about satanic laughter, the laughter that we express as a form of superiority over animals and our own mortality and sometimes others. And Baudelaire looks at this as like, this is the laughter of pride, the laughter of hubris, of superiority. And that is not good, because laughter is not always, it may not always be satanic, but if we look at this and kind of from the kind of prismatic point of view, right, from different perspectives, we can see that inferiority theory and satanic laughter really have a deep connection with sexist, racist, and homophobic jokes, because it is an attempt to assert superiority over another person. And Baudelaire is saying, no, like, this is not us at our finest moment. So satanic laughter, bad, because it is an attempt at pride and superiority that we haven't even earned yet, not by a long shot. Okay, so Nietzsche. So we have transcendental laughter, Jean-Luc Nancy, satanic laughter, Charles Baudelaire, and finally we have golden laughter, which is Nietzsche. And he too, very much like Baudelaire, talks about the way in which we can reject reason and rationality and just be who we are using this élan vital, right? This life force. We can use it as a transgressive force, as a corrective, as a step towards self-consciousness, historical self-awareness, and becoming deeply and perhaps for the first time, utterly aware of our position in the world. So this kind of golden laughter, this overall attitude of our position in the world. And once we acknowledge that, then that affirmation of the world is actually a good thing. It's joyous. And any kind of spirit of seriousness, any kind of authority figure, we say, no, we refuse you. We're going to walk our own path, and we're going to be able to do it with a degree of consistency and happiness because it's what we want. So golden laughter is the laughter of just walking away from authority figures and seriousness and basically truly and deeply enjoying what life has to offer to us. The last person here, Simon Critchley, talks about laughter as an affirmative expression of our finite human understanding, very much like Jean-Luc Nancy, an acknowledgement that our understanding of ourselves and the world is limited, right? We can only go so far. Remember, we're in that prison house of language, and language is slippery and elusive. We don't always mean what we say or say what we mean, or we end up saying something that we cannot take back, etc. So Critchley looks at humor in terms of this, the lens of the inability for us to grasp the world in any truly significant way. And we simply say, okay, chaos isn't far away, but do we, buckle under anxiety, or do we simply say, no, it's tragic, but it's also funny? And again, it kind of sounds like coping humor, isn't it? It's a way for us to cope with the fact that we now acknowledge and admit to ourselves that the world is complicated. And when that happens, be mindful. There will always be authority figures that come along to say, I've got the answer. You come and follow me. Walk in the opposite direction. Follow Nietzsche and walk away from them. Finally, we talk about, we mentioned Helmut Plessner, talking about how laughter is literally at the core of our experience, our humanity. It's something that we do. And ultimately, what happens is humor is based on the contradiction between our image of some sort of a coherent self, a coherent reality, and the fact that the two will quite often break down. And in that sense, it's a little bit like incongruity theory. The fact that the world is complex and unpredictable and sometimes ambiguous. It's not that it can never be known, but it is to a certain degree ambiguous until you stop and think about it. And Plessner talks about the way in which we try to have mastery over our own bodies, our minds, our worldview, and we don't always succeed. And if we don't succeed, we should simply laugh. And so each one of these thinkers kind of say similar things. Baudelaire talks about satanic laughter, but certainly Nancy, Nietzsche, Critchley, and Plessner all say essentially the same thing. We have a limited understanding of the world, and rather than freak out over it, we should just laugh at it and see, well, what's the best we can do? And that's kind of the postmodern world, right? Don't take anything seriously. Now, finally, module 13, this is the last one. And this is, I think, the module that kind of brings everything all together, especially the second half of the second half when we talk about postmodernism. And these are the ideas of Noel Carroll. So they are not in the book, but they come from a smaller book, the one I showed you in the video. And he says, humor plays with the norms that govern the society and culture and alerts us to the norms by reinforcing them. And what he means by that is when we laugh at something, we're laughing at what is actually occurring. And that is kind of the manifest content of the joke. But the latent content is, or are, all the norms and predictable kind of behavior, all the things that we expect people to do. And when we see a disconnect between those two things, quite often it's done humorously. And the way in which humor works, according to Carroll, and I think he's certainly correct in this case, is humor plays with these norms because all of us share these presuppositions, these expectations and norms in order for us to understand how the joke works. In other words, when we see something or someone do something stupid, it's stupid because we expected them to behave differently. That different behavior is the norm that all of us, grew up learning and knowing and expected others to do the same thing. So the humor lies in the disconnect between the assumption and the actual behavior. Now, that's one idea. Another one that Carroll talks about is this, and we talked about it earlier with humor and ethics, the idea that humor can construct and maintain an us versus them sort of duality. And of course, the us is always the right-thinking people. We're always the smarter of the two. And the them, and the them could be literally anybody. And depending on who it is and what we're making fun of, this can be racist or sexist or homophobic or any number of these things, because we are identifying a group of individuals who are not like us. And of course, the us is always the better of the two. So humor will reinforce our awareness of these norms by pointing out the comic deviation. But at the same time, we need to be very careful that the degree to which we do that, we're not isolating ourselves from that other group. If we think back to Plato, when he said at the very beginning, I think the first class we had, Plato, yes, talked about superiority theory and said it was awful, but he at least allowed humor in an educational manner. In other words, to teach people how to do something correctly or better, or at least the way we expect them to do, because those are the norms. But if we're laughing at someone because of something they're doing and we're not taking the time to correct them, we continue laughing at them, then that really solidifies that us versus them kind of thinking. And that can become very dangerous for a community. So the last thing too is the immorality of humor and comedy. Is that even possible? Is it possible for a joke to be amoral? And when we talk about ethnic minorities, disempowered individuals, are they still able to be the butt of a joke? Well, we need to unpack that. And jokes that perpetuate negative stereotypes, we know they're out there. And if the joke is trying to go beyond that racist or sexist stereotype to teach us something about it, then Plato would say, yeah, I'm uncomfortable, but I can see where you're going with it. But if it simply is there to reinforce not only the us versus them mentality, but laughing at them because of what they're doing, and especially something they cannot change, then we have a real issue with humor, which is why, and this is why it's highlighted in red, it matters who is telling the joke, in what context, and for what reason. That is really, I think, the one thing I would like you to remember in this course. So if humor is used for the purpose of an in-group solidarity, it is acceptable, right? The us versus them, because we have a common enemy. But if the same joke is told by an outsider to insult others, it is hurtful, because that other group is not in on the joke. It's not an inclusive, but an exclusive joke. That kind of humor, racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on, those are the kinds of jokes that we must feel uncomfortable with, because they're simply trying to perpetuate and reinforce a cultural stereotype, a social structure of not having opportunities. it doesn't solve anything. It doesn't allow us to think outside the box. If anything, it keeps us inside the box, keeps us thinking uncritically. So any joke that tries to pass itself off as enlightened, but is in fact completely uncritical of a situation that is racist or sexist, is no longer a joke. So is that the case? And Noel Carroll finishes up here, says, okay, one argument against this particular idea is that a distinction needs to be made between the form and the content of a joke. If the form is really interesting, then there might be some redeeming qualities. Or if the content of what appears to be a racist or sexist joke only on the surface is so, but in fact there's something else going on that subverts or undermines the notion of racism, then perhaps it has some qualities worth considering. So there's always the possibility that a sexist or racist interpretation is subjective or open to interpretation. Another argument against this attitude is that we're dealing with fictional characters. But again, let's not kid ourselves. Fictional characters that are based on cultural stereotypes, there's a degree of reality and truth in that should make us uncomfortable. So we need to be always careful about the interpretation of the joke. What is meant, right? What is meant by that particular joke, and why is it being said? Again, it matters who's saying it, in what context, and for what reason. So a joke may be immoral, but it could still be funny because of the wordplay, or because it has no other formal aspect that's worth considering, interesting imagery or something else. If it is completely repulsive, yeah, it isn't something that is worth hanging on to. And really what it depends on is the anticipated response of the listener. If the person telling the joke to a friend or someone else, they expect them to laugh at the racist or sexist or homophobic content because that's the reason why they're telling them a joke, yeah, there's something inherently wrong. So the joke is evil only when we are asked to consider the content as such and not critically. That's ultimately what is worth thinking about. Okay, so that is the material, the content for modules 8 through 13. I know there's a lot of stuff, but what I wanted to do in this sort of overview is kind of try to tie some of them together, seeing how inferiority theory and superiority theory have a lot in common. Some thinkers essentially say the same thing, but say it slightly differently. But the overall concern with the postmodern world is our inability to arrive at some sort of authoritarian truth, right? It's just not possible anymore because we have so many voices speaking that we have to contend with different versions of reality. Not better or worse, just different versions of reality. And we eventually will amalgamate all of these into a worldview that we are comfortable with. And like Nietzsche, then we can engage in the golden laughter. Okay, so thank you so much for taking this course in the first place. I hope you enjoyed the material and hope you enjoyed the fact that you were able to think seriously about humor. And hopefully the videos as well have helped. So best of luck on the final exam. Like I said, in 4 parts, it's worth 50 marks. You have 2 hours to write it. Accommodation students have already been accommodated, so you're good. Any questions before you start, shoot me a quick email and I will answer it right away or as soon as I see it. In the meantime, thanks very much for taking the course. And if you see me in the hallway, say hi and we'll talk for a few minutes. Take care then. Bye-bye.